McRae, settle down.
When the British defeated the Turkish Ottoman Empire during World War I, they had promised their Arab allies independence. 25 years later, the oil-rich nations of the Middle East remained under British rule, directly or through puppet monarchs. The subjugated Arabs longed for the establishment of Arabic leadership. It was this desire that inspired many Arabs across the Middle East to band together under what became known as the Pan-Arabism movement. Pan-Arabism is an ideology that calls for the unification of the peoples and countries of the Arab world. Advocates of Pan-Arabism strongly opposed Western political involvement in the Arab world. It also sought to empower Arab states from outside forces by forming alliances and, to a lesser extent, economic cooperation. Secular Pan-Arab parties such as the Baath and Nasserist parties sprung up in almost every Arab country. They actually took power in Egypt, Libya, Iraq, and Syria. There were several attempts to bring about a pan-Arab state in many other countries, all of which ultimately resulted in failure. In the period of decolonialism following World War II, Arab nationalism had overshadowed Pan-Islamism, which is a political movement advocating the unity of Muslims under one Islamic state. Unlike Arabism, which calls to unite all Arabic people, regardless of religion, race, or nationality, Islamism is a form of religious nationalism. It differentiates itself from other ideologies by excluding culture and ethnicity as primary factors towards unification. In 1963, Iran was under the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, Shah of Iran. The Shah came to power during World War II after an Anglo-Soviet invasion forced the abdication of his father. During his reign, the Iranian oil industry was nationalized and the Shah's White Revolution began. The White Revolution was a series of economic and social reforms intended to transform Iran into a global power, succeeded in modernizing the nation, nationalizing many natural resources, and extending suffrage to women. With Iran's great oil wealth, Mohammad Reza Shah became the preeminent leader of the Middle East and self-styled guardian of the Persian Gulf. In 1961, he defended his style of rule, saying, "When Iranians learn to behave like Swedes, I will behave like the King of Sweden." Under the Shah's reign, the national Iranian income showed an unprecedented rise. These reforms met opposition from an Islamic leader named Ruhollah Mustafa Musawa Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini, an Iranian and influential Islamic fundamentalist leader, disagreed with the new reforms that undermined the privileges that the Iranian religious leaders, known as mullahs, had acquired over the centuries. Throughout the Middle East, and in particular Egypt, the various branches of the Muslim Brotherhood have significantly challenged the secular nationalist or monarchical Muslim governments, such as that of Iran and Iraq. The Shah, a U.S. ally, reacted by deporting the Ayatollah, who took refuge in Iraq. The Shah was disliked in the Middle East region because of his alliance with the United States. Other Arab nations viewed this as a threat to Pan-Arabism, which many Arab nations were hoping to maintain. The rise of Islamic fundamentalism was a viable danger to the region, which not only sought a unified Arab resistance against the West, but also had internal conflict that would turn nation against nation. Despite Khomeini's Islamic affiliation, President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr of Iraq welcomed and assured his safety in Iraq. However, in order to minimize any conflict with Iran, Iraq imposed certain restrictions upon Khomeini's political activities in Iraq, to which the Ayatollah agreed for the time being. The overthrow of the Shah came as a surprise to almost all observers. The first militant anti-Shah demonstrations of a few hundred began in October 1977. A year later, strikes were paralyzing the country. In early December of that year, a total of 6 to 9 million, more than 10% of the country, marched against the Shah throughout Iran. On January 16, 1979, under pressure, the Shah left Iran, and opposition leader Shapur Bakhtiar became Prime Minister of Iran. Bakhtiar dissolved the secret police, freed all political prisoners. In addition, he allowed the Ayatollah Khomeini to return to Iran after years in exile. He asked Khomeini to create a Vatican-like state in Qom. He also promised free elections and called upon the opposition to help preserve the constitution, proposing a national unity government including Khomeini's followers. Khomeini fiercely rejected Bakhtiar's leadership and appointed his own interim government, with Mehdi Bazargan as prime minister. In February, pro-Khomeini revolutionary guerrilla and rebel soldiers gained the upper hand in street fighting, giving them control of the country. By national referendum, Iran became an Islamic Republic on April 1, 1979. Khomeini became supreme leader of the country in December 1979. The revolution was unusual. It lacked many of the customary causes of revolution. It produced a widespread change at great speed. It was massively popular. It overthrew a puppet regime heavily protected by a lavishly financed army and security services, and replaced a modernizing monarchy with a theocracy based on guardianship of the Islamic jurists. Its outcome, an Islamic Republic under the guidance of an extraordinary religious scholar from Qom, was, as one scholar put it, clearly an occurrence that had to be explained. Most importantly, Khomeini preached that revolt, and especially martyrdom against injustice and tyranny, was part of Shia Islam, and that Muslims should reject the influence of both liberal capitalism and communism, with the slogan, "Neither East nor West, Islamic Republic." The overthrowing of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi led to a steady deterioration in Iran-U.S. relations. But the Middle East was not a top priority of the Carter administration.
If you remember back to it, this was a period, of course, this is a time of sort of the late détente period. Things had gone downhill since Nixon and Brezhnev had signed accords in 1972. A number of conservatives in the U.S. were unhappy with détente and thought that we were giving too much away to the Soviets. We had been burned in Vietnam, so there was an isolationist period. I think in American history, Americans weren't interested in adventures. Carter came in as a president more determined to work with domestic issues.
In neighboring Iraq, the pro-Arabic Ba'ath Party was supportive of overthrowing the American-aligned Shah of Iran because his imperialistic influence was seen as an attempt to stifle the pan-Arab movement in the Arab world. However, Iraq was also not in support of the Islamic regime led by Khomeini, for it threatened to upset the delicate Shia-Sunni relations in Iraq. Meanwhile, the United States' continued support of the fallen Shah angered the Iranians further when the U.S. admitted the now exiled former leader into the country to pursue cancer treatments at the Mayo Cancer Institute in September 1979. A group of students calling themselves Muslim student followers of the Imam's line in Tehran had been steadily growing and observing the country's political scene. These Khomeini followers saw the United States welcoming of the Shah as an insult to the Iranian people. America was dining with their enemy. On November 4, 1979, in retaliation, the group led a crowd which included the current Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, of about 500 people, and seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, capturing 66 Americans. 6 others evaded capture by hiding in the Canadian and Swiss embassies. They later escaped the country using Canadian passports in a rescue mission now known as the Canadian Caper. Of the captives, 13 were released on November 19th and 20th, 1979. One was released on July 11th, 1980. 52 remained in captivity. In an effort to force Iran to the negotiating table, President Carter applied economic pressure by halting oil imports from Iran and freezing Iranian assets in the United States. He also began several diplomatic initiatives to free the hostages, all of which were in vain. While President Carter was negotiating ways of having the captured Americans brought back home, Iraq was adjusting to its new president, Saddam Hussein, who had taken over power from President LaPierre in July 1979, 4 months prior to the hostage situation. The Iraqi government was getting restless regarding the instability in Iran. Their fears were becoming a reality in Iraq. A Shia riot broke out in An-Najaf, where Khomeini had resided for 15 years before his expulsion. The fruits of his indoctrinations had taken hold of the Iraqi people. In spite of Iraq's concerns, nonetheless, President Bakir desired to maintain civil relations with Iran's new government. He sent a personal message to Khomeini offering best wishes for the friendly Iranian people on the occasion of the establishment of the Islamic Republic. Iraqi officials also invited the new Iranian president, Mehdi Bazargan, to visit Iraq, hoping to further enhance relations between the two nations. However, Bazargan's government was in turn overthrown in late 1979 by radical Islamic militants who advocated for an expansionist foreign policy. This development further spoiled the fragile Iraqi-Iranian relations. In July of the same year, power had switched hands in Iraq, from the ailing President Bakir, who passed the mantle to his cousin Saddam, who had been his vice president and was eagerly waiting for the moment. Saddam, however, was facing tensions in his own territory. He feared the visible effects of the Islamic Revolution on the Iraqi people. Khomeini's Islamic teachings threatened to upset the delicate Sunni-Shia balance in Iraq. Several Shia-led violent incidents that broke out following Khomeini's call for Iraqis to overthrow Saddam. Personal enmity between Khomeini and Saddam would catapult the reasons that would bring both countries to war in the following year. It was the mutual distaste of Iran and Khomeini that brought Saddam and the U.S. closer together. The U.S. saw the anti-Western Khomeini as a threat to its Gulf access, which the U.S. had shared with the Shah, while Saddam viewed this as an opportunity to be seen as the viable power in the Gulf region. Also, his dislike of the Russians' invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 further sealed his alliance with the United States.
Think of the regimes that you have. On the one hand, you have a new, revolutionizing, radical Islamic regime, which is also nationalistic in the sense that they've thrown out the Shah, who they saw as a puppet of the United States. I remember back before the Shah fell, there were demonstrations on U.S. college campuses by Iranians against him. He was a repressive dictator, modernizing but repressive. And so then you have Ayatollah Khomeini come in. You have this whole radicalized student movement that takes control of the U.S. Embassy. And so it's this revolutionary fervor, which I think is pretty well gone in Iran at this point, certainly among the younger group. But early on, yeah, they're really fired up.
For the U.S., Saddam was not that much better.
And then next door you have this brutal dictator in the form of Saddam Hussein, who I think sees an opportunity to gain a little territory, as he did in 1991 when he went into Kuwait. And the stakes are really high in these countries because they control so much of the world's oil. Saudi Arabia has a quarter of the known reserves if you leave out Canada's oil sands. Iran has 11%, I think about 15% of the world's natural gas. And Iraq has about 10% of the world's oil reserves, which is more than five times what we have. So it was, I think, on Saddam's part, a power play. And in both cases, you have, on the one hand, a dictator who is more than willing to use poison gas against his own people, the Kurds, whom he believes are not loyal, which was pretty much true. And on the other hand, a group of fanatics in Iran who are willing to send their young people out to get blown up by the mines. So it is, I'm not sure there's any deeper explanation than that.
Back in Iran, the United States, desperate for a victory in Iran's hostage crisis, attempted a rescue mission on April 24, 1980. Operation Eagle Claw was an American military operation ordered by President Jimmy Carter to attempt to put an end to the Iran hostage crisis by rescuing the 52 Americans held captive at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran. The public, humiliating debacle that ensued damaged American prestige worldwide and is believed by many, including Carter himself, to have played a major role in his defeat in the 1980 presidential election. The plan called for a minimum of 6 helicopters. 8 were sent in. 2 helicopters could not navigate through a very fine sand cloud, which forced one helicopter to crash land and the other to return to the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. 6 helicopters reached the initial rendezvous point, Desert 1, but one of them had damaged its hydraulic systems. The spares were on one of the 2 helicopters that had aborted. From the early planning stages, it had been determined that if fewer than 6 operational helicopters were available, then the mission would be automatically aborted, even though only 4 were absolutely necessary for the operation. In a move still debated, the commanders on the scene requested to abort the mission. Carter gave his approval. As the U.S. force prepared to leave Iran, one of the helicopters crashed into a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft containing fuel and a group of servicemen. The resulting fire destroyed the 2 aircraft involved and resulted in the remaining helicopters being left behind, along with the deaths of 8 American servicemen. President Carter continued to attempt to secure the release of the hostages before the end of his presidency. Despite extensive last-minute negotiations, he did not succeed. On January 20th, 1981, minutes after Carter's term in office ended, the 52 U.S. captives held at the U.S. Embassy in Iran were released, ending the 444-day Iran hostage crisis. Tensions between Iran and Iraq were growing as the delicate relations between the countries soured, while U.S. support shifted from Iran to Iraq during the strained 444 days that Iran held on to American hostages.
The Iran-Iraq war had big implications for the regional balance of power, but some of those things were already transforming even before the war began. I mean, basically, Iran had been a U.S. ally since 1954 when the U.S. put the Shah in power, right? Toppled, a democratically elected government, really. Put the Shah in power. He was our guy. It was called a bastion of stability. He sold oil to the Israelis. I mean, he was a valuable ally in the Middle East. Iraq, I think it'd probably be a little bit strong to call them a Soviet client state, depending on how you want to think about a client state. But most of their armaments came from the Soviet Union. But starting in the 70s, many of those oil-rich states had great revenues to buy weapons. So the U.S. and the Soviets were the 2 big suppliers of weapons, and the Iraqis bought mostly Soviet weapons. So the client state may be a little strong, but so you had a situation that by the end of the 70s, Iran had long been a U.S. ally, but now had had an internal revolution and was a potentially revolutionary state right there in the Middle East instead of an island of stability. And Iraq, thanks to years now of military purchases from the Soviet Union, had a pretty substantial military. And then because of this revolutionary fervor in Iran, and as we've learned, focusing on Iraq very much the last decade, that there's a Shia majority in both Iran and Iraq. So Iran basically was trying to push some of its revolutionary ideals outside of its borders. I mean, it was a revolutionary state. So it was engaging in border skirmishes. It was trying to encourage the domestic Shia and even the Kurds within Iraq to, rise up and cause trouble internally. It was apparently authorizing assassination campaigns against particular Iraqi leaders. And so, eventually Saddam Hussein had enough and launched this war against Iran on the idea, I think, to stop this revolutionary fervor.
Along with a long history of border disputes and Iraqi fears of an internal uprising among its long-suppressed Shia majority, influenced by the Iranian Revolution, a series of events sent the two nations rushing down the path of war. On April 1, 1980, an Iranian student was responsible for the bombing of an Iraqi university during a failed assassination attempt on Iraq's foreign minister, Tariq Aziz. At the time of the bombing, President Saddam was visiting the Iraqi city of Suwara near the Iranian border. In his welcoming speech, he strongly affirmed the following.
The Iraqi people do not wish to break off relations with any state, unless some state so desires, and believes it could endanger the sovereignty of our country or offend the will of our nation. We proclaim to any state wanting to halt relations with Iraq and the Arab nation that we are determined to combat its interference. We are not prepared to give way before our duty and the defense of our principles.
The next day, Saddam visited the victims at the hospital and continued to strengthen his people and urge Iranians not to meddle in Iraqi affairs. On April 5, 1980, another bomb was thrown from the window of an Iranian school during the funeral of one of the victims of the university attack on April 1st. An investigation of the bombings led to the discovery of an underground Iranian-supported Al-Dawat party and to the discovery of several depots in which great amounts of money and weapons were found. Al-Dawat al-Islam was a small revolutionary organization adhering to the ideas of Khomeini. In response to these findings, the Iraqi government rounded up and deported thousands of members of Al-Dawat, Shias of Iranian origin. On April 12, 1980, another failed assassination attempt was made at Latif and Saif Jassim, Iraqi's Minister of Culture, Government, and Information. The assailant was soon arrested and confessed his ties with the Al-Dawat party. Conflicts contributing to the hostilities between the two countries ranged from century-old Sunni versus Shia and Arab versus Persian religious and ethnic disputes among many, to a personal animosity between Saddam Hussein and Ayatollah Khomeini. In the days following the university attacks, Khomeini led several media-based appeals for an Islamic Revolution in Iraq. He called upon the Iraqi people to do their duty of overthrowing the suppressive Ba'ath Party, which he claimed was non-Islamic. Khomeini began encouraging his former colleagues to overthrow Saddam Hussein because his regime was anti-Islamic. This was part of Khomeini's broader strategy of spreading the Islamic Revolution throughout the Middle East. Islamic revolutionists such as Gotsadeh announced in a broadcast message that the duty of the Iranian people was to give its aid to the people of Iraq, who are subjected to the repressive criminal regime, claiming that only the downfall of Saddam Hussein's regime would satisfy him. Several other Iranian Islamic leaders also continued to motivate the Iraqis to revolt against their government. These Islamic fundamentalists also sent out provocative statements, claiming Iran's readiness to occupy Iraq and calling for the fall of the Ba'ath regime. They urged the Iraqis to fight, be defiant, to affiliate with Islamic groups for military training, and to resist the reign of the Ba'ath by all means. All means led to one of the bloodiest wars in Middle East history. The Iran-Iraq War, an armed conflict between the armed forces of Iraq and Iran, is also known as the Imposed War and Holy Defense in Iran, or Saddam's Qadisiyah in Iraq. This was the first Persian Gulf War. After the aggression at the university, tensions between the two countries continued to deteriorate until September 4, 1980, the day Iran took the initiative to bombard several Iraqi cities and oil installations. This discreetly publicized attack by the Iranians fixed the real beginning of the war between these two countries. In a press conference of November 11, 1980, Saddam asserted to his people,
"We set forth the full truth of our situation to the Iranians, and we took an oath that the bloodshed at Mustansariya would not be an act without repercussions."
Most importantly for Iraq, Saddam hoped for swift victory. He was keenly interested in elevating Iraq to a strong regional power. A successful invasion of Iran would enlarge Iraq's oil reserves and make Iraq the dominant power in the Persian Gulf region. Saddam seized an opportunity to invade Iran during its weakened state of inner turmoil. He hoped to take advantage of revolutionary disorder in Iran and attacked without official warning. On September 22, 1980, Iraq launched a simultaneous invasion by air and land into Iranian territory. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein claimed as the reason for his attack on Iran a territorial dispute over the Shatt al-Arab, a waterway that empties into the Persian Gulf and forms the boundary between Iran and Iraq. The revolution posed what seemed to be both an enormous opportunity and a dire threat to the Iraqi government now under the control of Hussein. On the one hand, Iran was in disarray. The various elements in the coalition that overthrew the Shah were badly divided, and the army was being purged. Further, the taking of American hostages in November 1979, combined with the desire of the new government to free the country from all foreign influence, left Iran internationally isolated. Never had Iraq's rival been so vulnerable. Iraqi troops invaded Iran along a front some 300 miles long. Numerous and well-equipped Iraqi forces overwhelmed the small Iranian border units and advanced into southwestern Iran. With the far side of the Shatt al-Arab thus secured, Iraq captured the southern border city of Khorramshahr in the oil-rich Khuzestan province and began besieging other towns along the frontier. However, the Iranian resistance was stiffer than Iraq expected. Using its superior naval power, Iran quickly mounted an effective sea blockade. Standing up to Iraq's larger air force, the Iranian Air Force issued retaliatory raids that checked Iraq's advance on the ground. In January 1981, Iran launched its first counteroffensive, but Iraq decimated the assault. The war entered a protracted stalemate. As the stalemate continued, Iran was able to mobilize irregular forces, including the Revolutionary Guard, an ill-trained but dedicated corps of fighters. By early 1982, the struggle for political power in post-revolutionary Iran was resolved, allowing the government to pursue a more coherent war policy. Iran seized the initiative with several offensives that pushed Iraq out of much of Iran and brought the fighting into Iraqi territory. Throughout the summer and fall of 1982, Iranian attacks across the border focused on splitting the south of Iraq, where the majority of the Shias lived, from the north, and capturing the southern Iraqi city of al-Basra. The Iranian offensives of 1982 set a pattern that continued for the rest of the war. Exploiting their superiority in numbers, Iran sent its Revolutionary Guard on the attack, supported by regular military forces. Outnumbered Iraqi forces inflicted heavy losses on the Iranians, but ultimately fell back. As soon as the initial Iranian thrust had exhausted itself, however, the Iraqi army exploited Iranian disorganization and lack of equipment to retake much of the lost territory. As the war continued, Iraq's defense grew increasingly desperate. As early as 1983, the armed forces used poison gas against Iranian troops. Iraq also widened the war to civilian targets, launching missiles against Iranian cities, bombing Iranian oil installations, and attacking Iranian shipping in the Persian Gulf. Iran responded with attacks against civilian and economic targets in Iraq. There was no end in sight to the wholesale killing. International reaction to the Iran-Iraq War was remarkably muted, at least at the outset. Although the United Nations Security Council called for a ceasefire after a week of fighting and renewed the call on later occasions, the initial call was made while Iraq occupied Iranian territory. Moreover, the UN refused to come to Iran's aid to repel the Iraqi invasion. The Iranians thus interpreted the UN as subtly biased in favor of Iraq. Outside the UN, other governments took few constructive steps to end the fighting, which was unusual for a war of such proportions. The international silence was partly caused by Iran's isolation and the mutual hostility between Iran and the West in the wake of Iran's Islamic Revolution. Further, Iran did not actively seek international support, wanting to remain free of relationships that might make it beholden to other nations. Iraq, expecting an easy victory against a vulnerable opponent, also did not seek international support in the early stages of the war. Only within the Middle East did either side seek to win diplomatic support. Most Arab states regarded Iraq warily, but were even more frightened by the prospect of a victory by the revolutionary Iranian regime. Slowly at first, then more quickly after 1982, most Arab states, especially Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the other states of the Arabian Peninsula, aided Iraq militarily and diplomatically. Iran had few friends in the region. Syria, a longtime rival of Iraq, stood out in the Arab world for its support of Iran, and at times Libya offered its support. The prolonged fighting forced both sides to search desperately for military equipment, even if it meant dealing with former enemies. At the start of the war, Iraq had no diplomatic relations with the United States due to its friendly relations with the USSR and its long-standing conflict with Israel, the main U.S. ally in the Middle East. As the war continued, however, Iraq toned down its rhetoric to gain American support. The West definitely did not want Iran to emerge victorious. The consensus was that Khomeini was a serious threat to the stability of the region and to U.S. vital interest, notably oil supplies and Israeli security. The United States responded by giving trade credits to Iraq and supplying the Iraqi armed forces with intelligence information through Saudi Arabia. In 1982, with Iranian successes on the battlefield, the U.S. made its backing of Iraq more pronounced, supplying it with intelligence, economic aid, and by normalizing relations with the government, which had been broken during the 1967 Six-Day War.
He was an Arab strongman, and the U.S. was used to dealing with Arab strongmen during the Cold War. There was an old saying during the Cold War, he might be a bastard, but he's our bastard. That really didn't apply to Saddam at the beginning. But once the Iran-Iraq War broke out, I think the U.S. and Washington reluctantly decided, well, maybe, between these two difficult choices, let's see if we can make him our bastard. Not necessarily to serve American purposes in that war, but to prevent something that the U.S. definitely didn't want to happen, which was Iran winning that war. I mean, Iran is already a bigger state, more populous state. From a classic balance of power perspective, there was a great risk that Iran might prevail in Iran-Iraq war, and the U.S. certainly did not want to see an expansionary Iran that would have all of those oil resources of Iran and Iraq. That would have been a disaster for U.S. foreign policy. So, however reluctantly, however you want to frame exactly the decision-making process, and I'm not sure we're yet clear on all that. Certainly by 1982, 83, 84, during the war, the U.S. was more and more moving towards Iraq. Iraq, for example, had been listed as a state sponsor of terrorism. Congress mandates that every administration basically maintain a list of states that sponsor terrorism, and if you're on that list, there are things that you cannot have in terms of policy, like you're ineligible for American foreign assistance, you cannot buy weapons from the United States. Iraq had been on that list primarily because of support for Palestinian movements against Israel, but in 1982 the United States removed Iraq from that list in order to be able to provide some indirect assistance in the Iran-Iraq War. I think by 83, 84, we had essentially established relatively normal diplomatic relations. Donald Rumsfeld was named as a special envoy. He went to Iraq at least twice. Many people on the internet, I think, have seen the famous picture of him shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. You know, it would be too strong, I think, to call it an alliance at anywhere the kind of level of, say, NATO or something. But, you know, certainly there were a lot of common interests between Iraq and the United States at that time in the 1980s.
President Ronald Reagan decided that the United States could not afford to allow Iraq to lose the war to Iran, and that the United States would do whatever was necessary to prevent Iraq from losing the war with Iran. The U.S. also supplied the Iraqi regime with chemical and biological weapons, heavy trucks, armored ambulances, and communications gear, as well as industrial technology for military purposes.
It's clear that the U.S. Helped them get some loans so that they could support the war. It provided them with some agricultural assistance so that it didn't have to spend money in one area so that it could basically go to another area. By removing them, say, from the terrorism list, the U.S. was able to provide some dual-use equipment, like trucks, for example, that on favorable terms to Iraq so that, you know, they could prosecute the war against Iran. There's some evidence that even some of the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction programs, and I think particularly of the chemical and biological programs, that certain of the elements that went into that were things that were obtained dual use in the 1980s as part of this import-export exchange. You may remember that when the anthrax attacks were in the U.S. and this Des Moines strain was identified, one of the places where that had been exported, and it wasn't, you know, just, oh, it went to Iraq. I mean, it went everywhere. I mean, the Des Moines strain was the research strain that was widely used, but one of the places it ended up was in Iraq.
Equally important, the United States dropped objections to efforts by its allies, especially France, to give weapons and other supplies to Iraq. The United States was motivated in part by a desire to back its friends in the region, most of whom supported Iraq, and in part by its fear of the broader consequences of an Iranian victory. Iraq also relied heavily on the USSR for military supplies. Iran was also willing to accept support from its former enemies. Since Iran's military had been built under the rule of the pro-American Shah, most of its equipment was of American origin. So, while the new revolutionary government was hostile to both the United States and Israel, it needed American spare parts. Israel could supply some of these and chose to do so early in the war. Israel was anxious to undercut Iraq, a potential Arab adversary. Equally remarkable, the United States government opened a secret channel for selling arms to Iran in 1985, even as it urged other governments to stop all military sales to the country. American motives seemed designed partly to induce pro-Iranian groups in Lebanon to release Americans held captive there, and partly to improve relations with Iran. Profits from the arms sales were channeled to right-wing guerrillas in Nicaragua, known as Contras, to supply arms for use against the leftist Nicaraguan regime. The exposure of the secret policy in 1986 greatly embarrassed the government of U.S. President Ronald Reagan. As the war continued, Iraq, no longer believing it could achieve the sweeping victory it had hoped for at the outset, concentrated more and more on simply preventing an Iranian victory. Nevertheless, by 1986, Iraq's condition grew increasingly desperate. Its ability to hold its defensive positions was threatened by Iran's willingness to suffer enormous casualties. Iran sent massive numbers of older men, children, and sometimes women as human waves against Iraq's better-equipped forces. Although thousands upon thousands of these poorly armed forces were slaughtered with each assault, the Iranian government continued to send them to the front. With its larger population, Iran seemed confident that it would ultimately prevail. Iraq also mustered civilians not normally called on to fight, and by the mid-1980s, its population was severely strained. In 1986, Iran captured the Iraqi Gulf town of Al-Faw. Iraq responded with more effective techniques, especially the use of massive amounts of poison gas to thwart Iran's frontal assaults. Iraq also stepped up its attacks on Iranian cities, oil installations, and shipping, drawing severe Iranian reprisals against Iraqi oil production and shipping that prompted more American activity in the Gulf. Although clashes between American and Iranian forces fell far short of full-scale battles, the American presence nevertheless brought an end to Iranian superiority over Iraq at sea, giving Iraq time to resupply its weaponry and stop the Iranian ground advance. By 1988, Iraq, sufficiently rearmed and regrouped, drove the Iranians out of Al-Faw and several other border areas. Iran was in no position to launch a counterattack, and the international situation seemed increasingly favorable to Iraq. Many Iranian leaders concluded that the war could not be won. On July 3, 1988, the U.S. Navy cruiser USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655. All of the 290 passengers and crew perished. The American government claimed that the airliner had been mistaken for an Iranian F-14 Tomcat, and that the Vincennes was operating in international waters at the time and feared that it was under attack, which later appeared to be untrue. At the time, the captain of the Vincennes claimed that the Iranian plane did not identify itself and sent no response to warning signals from the Vincennes. That incident apparently led Ayatollah Khomeini to conclude that Iran could not risk the possibility of U.S. open combat operations against Iran, and he decided it was time to end the conflict. On August 20th, 1988, both sides ceased fighting in accordance with the terms of UN Resolution 598. The Iran-Iraq War lasted just short of 8 years and resulted in catastrophic destruction in both countries. Because both Iran and Iraq used irregular military units, attacked civilian populations, and played down their own losses while playing up those of their opponents, reliable casualty figures do not exist. Because of different battlefield techniques, Iraq's deaths were probably about half those suffered by Iran. The total number of people killed almost certainly exceeds 300,000. The number of wounded and captured soldiers pushed the casualty total over 1 million, and some estimates of total casualties exceed 2 million. After 8 years of fighting, neither side could claim victory. The border disputes were not resolved. Both tyrants remained in power and had shored up their internal support, but had lost influence outside their countries. Both countries suffered devastating losses of men, materiel, and financial resources. Nevertheless, Iraq emerged from the war with roughly 1 million men under arms, 500 combat aircraft, and 5,500 tanks. The nucleus of the force that would fight the U.S.-led coalition in the next Gulf War.